Thank you very much, Jess. I think what we'll do is start this evening. We have a fair number of people already joined us, and we will continue. Uh, yeah. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Amrit Singh. I'm a founding member of Transindus Limited, and we have been organizing tours to the Indian subcontinent for just over 30 years, as well as to Southeast Asia and the Far East, albeit the last 12 months have been a little bit challenging. We are joined today for this evening's presentation by Clive Williams OBE, and to discuss Berkshire and the wonderful houses and its Indian connections with us. I trust you've all been well and happy through the year and are looking forward to better times in the coming months. Now, although it's been a challenging year, it has had some positives, like allowing us to spend a little bit more quality time with our loved ones, reconnect with ourselves, eat a bit healthier, exercise more, and learn to adapt and innovate. At Transindus, we've used this time to learn and adapt ourselves and evolve into newer ventures so we can go on providing a service to you while sticking to our core values and principles of responsible travel and exploring newer destinations and travel with first-hand knowledge and expertise. As the UK's leading India specialist, we've had an amazing time these last few months in researching an array of UK sites that reflect over 300 years of shared history with the subcontinent. The result is a series of staycation tours that explore the incredible sites of the country in the company of some eminent experts and guest lecturers and tour leaders. We've also managed to organize some special access to properties that are not usually open to the public, and even uh, got some overnight stays in these incredible, beautiful historic houses. Where we haven't been able to stay in a historic house, we've sought out some lovely atmospheric country hotels where you can relax after a hard day of sightseeing. I'm delighted to unveil the first of these tours here tonight, the Nabobs of Berkshire. This is a 3-night, 4-day tour led by our guest speaker, Clive. On this tour, we visit the historic houses of Berkshire and stay in a historic house, Tonington Grove, which in itself had Nabob connections. Now, who are these Nabobs? They were the 18th and 19th century employees of the East India Company. That was the start of the British Empire in the subcontinent. And they amassed huge fortunes and wealth and returned to England as wealthy men. They all had, or a great many of them had, aspirations of public and political life. Many chose to settle in Berkshire as their estates. Such was their enthusiasm for the county that it was nicknamed the English Hindoostan. Other tours that we're looking at include the Derbyshire Grand Houses of Indian Heritage with Caroline Cornell and Georgina Haynes, who've been leading tours to India with us for many, many years. Maharaja Dalip Singh's Trail in the beautiful counties of Suffolk and Norfolk, or explore the places that he spent most of his life. He was the Maharaja of the Punjab and the head of the Sikh Empire. He acceded to his throne at the age of 5, was kidnapped, deposed, and exiled, all before by the time he was only 10 years old. So wonderful places in Suffolk and Norfolk that we can explore with his connections to the county. But for now, this evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Clive Williams, OBE, a lawyer, historian, and author who has spent most of his life in public service in Berkshire and has written an incredible anthology of the county with its great houses and the people and personalities behind them, and very importantly for us, their connections with India. His book is entitled The Nabobs of Berkshire, and we've borrowed some of the name of his book for our tour. And if any of you would like a copy of the book, do drop me a line, and I'm sure we'll be able to organize a copy, maybe even persuade Clive to sign a few. Just before we hand over to Clive, I have a few words of housekeeping. If everybody could switch off their microphones during the presentation, that would be very nice. And if you have a question, feel free to write them down in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screens, and we'll try and respond to them at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Clive now.
Thank you very much, Amrit. It's very strange sitting here. I normally bounce around a room, sitting in front of my my computer in my bedroom is very, very strange. I came to Berkshire from Wales in 1961, and for a time I shared a room with a young Indian research student. His name was Dwarkanath Bose, doctor, and he's known as Tutu. And he was the nephew of Subhachandra Bose, the great Indian nationalist leader. And he became one of my closest friends. And sadly, we were the same age, almost exactly the same age. And sadly, he died last August. So in effect, I dedicate this talk to Tutu, who I hope is up there looking down on us. And because in 1998, I'd already written the history of Basildon. I live in Basildon in Berkshire, not in Essex, in Berkshire. And of course, we have Basildon Park, which was built by the Nabobs, Sir Francis Sykes, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So when I wrote the history of Basildon, I obviously wrote about Basildon Park, and I tracked down Francis Sykes' successor, or descendant, who, like me, was a solicitor in Marlborough. And sadly, he's died too last year, and he was younger than me. So there we are, I'm still going. Lovely guy, Sir John Sykes. He was the 10th baronet. The 11th baronet, his son Charlie, is a colonel serving out in Afghanistan at the moment. Anyway, I went with my wife Christina to Calcutta in 1998 to stay with Tutu, and he took me to the South Park Street Cemetery. And when I went round it, I was remarked how many Berkshire names were there. So when I came back, I started doing research. It took me 10 years, and eventually I wrote up my book. And the trouble was there are so many places in Berkshire which have got historical associations. In fact, I found 30 houses with Nabob associations, and some had more than one. And obviously this evening we'll just talk about a few, and we will, on this tour, if you join it, we will visit some more of the properties. I like to start by saying that the connection between the West and the East goes way back to Roman times. And it was always a case of the West wanting what the East had rather than reverse, because actually in this country back then in Roman times, we had really had nothing to export. One of our exports was slaves, British slaves, which were sent off to Italy. I mention that because slavery is not a one-way thing. It started, people were being enslaved many thousands of years ago. So the Romans traded with India. Alfred the Great, in about 780 AD, he knew about India, and he sent ambassadors all the way out to India. And they came back later bearing costly pearls, but I think that's as far as it went. Then the Arabs took on the trade, and eventually in the 15th century, the Portuguese were the first Westerners to go straight out to the East by ship to try and get a bit of the trade and bring it back and cut out the middleman. The East India Company followed them in 1600. It was formed in 1600, the last years of Elizabeth I. And it was closely followed by the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company. And the two of them actually competed with the Portuguese to get a slice of the action. They wanted the spices, the rare stones, metals, the porcelain, the silks, all those sort of things that were much eagerly sought in the West. In fact, in the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch East India Company was better organized than the English East India Company. And as a result, in effect, the East India Company got booted out of the East Indies, although it kept the name. So it was always known as the East Indies Company, East India Company, but in fact, or John Company for short. But in fact, and although it still did trade a bit in the East Indies, most of its time subsequently was spent in India. And of course, it developed the three great centers of Calcutta, Madras or Chennai as it now is, and Bombay or Mumbai as it now is, and they became the main settlements for the East India Company. The companies, the fortunes, in fact, when the East India Company first went out there, the great Mogul emperors held sway over a large part of India. Certainly all of today's Pakistan, most of India, northern India, central India, and also Bangladesh. And to rule their area, they appointed deputies. And I gather the Urdu word for deputy is Nawab. And so they appointed these Nawabs to rule their vast provinces. And these are big provinces. I mean, Hyderabad, for instance, is the size of France. Bengal in those days included the whole of Bangladesh, West Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And that in area is about twice the size of the UK. In population then, even then, it was about 40 or 50 million, whereas the population of England and Wales then was perhaps no more than 5 million. So these were always very much bigger areas, much more populated than certainly than we were at the time. So and then the great Mughal emperors held sway over their territories until about 1708, when Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughal emperors, died. And after that, they began to lose control. There still was a Mughal emperor, but in effect, the Nawabs got far more control over their provinces. They became more like independent rulers. And things came to a head in Bengal in 1757 when the young Nawab of Bengal took over from his grandfather. His grandfather, Hyder Ali, took the view, he said, of the English, he said, they're like bees. He said, let them swarm around and make the honey, and then you can get the honey from their pot, but just let them get on with it, which was quite a clever sort of philosophy. But his grandson, I think it was grandson or great nephew, felt that the English had got too big for their boots, and a big row developed. And in the end, the Nawab took his army down to Bengal and eventually conquered it. Well, this was a humiliation for the English because they'd lost their prime possession in Bengal. And so it was in effect that Madras came to the rescue. And they had a fleet under Admiral Watson, and they had a young, they were called scribes. They were called Clive, my namesake, Robert Clive, who in effect had shown that great promise and had been very successful in the war with Nabob of Arcot. So they put him in command of the English, of the East India Company forces, and Watson had the navy, and the two of them advanced up the Hooghly River towards Calcutta. And eventually they took on the Nawab's army at Plassey in 1757, in June 1757, and he was defeated. They then put someone else on the throne, Amir Jaffa, who was a relation and a general. They'd done a deal with him in advance. Clive was very clever like that. And Mir Jaffa became a compliant ruler of Bengal. Later, they fell out with Mir Jaffa. They had more problems. And this was the time of Henry van Sittart. And eventually, after 1765, Clive persuaded the company to take over the whole of the ruling of Bengal. And they, in fact, were responsible for law and order, raising the taxes. They paid a sort of annual, in effect, fee to the Mogul Emperor, but they then had the control of one of the richest provinces in one of the richest countries in the world. And the really serious money was made from 1765 until about 1770. And somebody like, I'll talk about him later, Sykes of Basildon, that's when he made really serious money. I can't obviously at this stage go through the whole of the history of the East India Company thereafter, but that's certainly how they came to control Bengal by 1765. They, I like to say that most of the English and Scots and Irish and went off to work for the East India Company. Most of them died young. They died fast, they died young. The length of life in Bombay was reckoned to be about 2 monsoons. I've been through the death registers of the East India Company, which are kept in the British Library, most depressing. Page after page, all these young people not getting more than 24, 5, 6, 7, a lot of them pauper. I mean, 99% of the British who went off, or the English who went off to the East India Company, met early graves and made no money. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. But some did survive the climate, made money, and came back to this country. And when they came back, a lot of them settled in Berkshire in the 18th century. So many, in fact, that in the 18th century, Berkshire was known as the English Hindoostan. Why did they settle in Berkshire? Well, for one thing, the Crown was based at Windsor, and the Crown still held great power. So, you know, you were close to the source of power. Secondly, of course, Berkshire is quite near London and Parliament. And many of them actually became MPs, members of Parliament. In those days, there were 110 rotten boroughs that you could buy up. So somebody like Francis Sykes at Basildon, he bought the town of Wallingford. I think you can see it on the map. Yes, he bought Wallingford. It was then I suppose, a borough of about sort of 8,000 or 9,000. So about the same size it is today. It had 2 members of Parliament. I think in those days, Manchester had none. And so basically by buying up Wallingford, Sykes controlled 2 members of Parliament. He put one for himself, one for his son, or one for his nominee. I think there were about 25 Nabobs from Bengal in Parliament. They called themselves the Bengal Squad, or they were known as the Bengal Squad. I think there were about 12 from Bombay, and they were the Bombay Squad. So there you are, had about 37 Nabobs, and they formed and they were there to protect their interests because they were the nouveau riche of the day. People talked about them, but didn't much like them. So and the other reason they came to Berkshire is that there was a lot of intermarriage went on. As I say, so, you know, you had this sort of fraternizing between the families. You had close to London with its links. It was close to Windsor with the seat of power. And that, I think, is why, as I say, we had so many Nabobs coming back to Berkshire. And as I mentioned before, I found 30 Nabob houses and 35 Nabobs. Nabob itself, interestingly, is the anglicization of Nawab. And the diminutive is actually knob and snob. That's where we get knob and snob from, Nabob, knob, snob. So now I just want to talk in more detail about some of the properties. When I did this talk originally, we were going to go, I think, to Shottersbrook. I think we've had to change plans since then, but I will talk about Shottersbrook. I then want to talk about Basildon Park, which we will be visiting. I want to talk Purley Hall, which we will be visiting, and also Swallowfield, which I think we will visit again, and Englefield. And in Englefield, Richard Benyon, he's now Lord Benyon, is in residence. He's an old friend of mine, and I've managed to persuade him to allow us to have a tour of Englefield, and he's got a lot of very interesting East India Company material there, brought back from India in the mid-18th century by his former, another Richard Benyon. First start with Shottsbrook, Bisham Abbey, and Foxley Manor, which is the Van Settart family. And interestingly, the original occupiers of Shottsbrook were the Cherry family, and they then sold to the Van Settarts, and the Cherry family, who are also a Nabob family, then went and are associated with Denford, which is in West Berkshire, which we will also hopefully visit. So you've got a connection there between the Cherries, who are down, ended up in Denford, but started off in Shottesbrooke, and the Van Sittart family, who are still in residence. On the female side, the present residents at Shottesbrooke are in fact descendants of the Van Sittarts. So the only actual Nabob families that I know who are still in residence in situ are the Benyans down at Englefield and the Van Sittarts at Shottesbrooke. We've got started off with the most famous of them all was Henry Van Sittart. He was 1732 to 1770, and at the age of 28 in 1760, he was appointed governor of Bengal. He meant well, but he couldn't control his company, his council, very unruly council. In fact, he ended up fisticuffs with one of them, with Stanley Batson. He's from Wingfield. So in effect, in the end, they fell out with the Nabob of Bengal, Mir Qasim, to such an extent that the company eventually went to war with Mir Qasim. They defeated him at the Battle of Buxar in 1764. And it was after that that Clive managed to persuade the company to take over the Diwani, which is the right to rule Bengal. There was, in fact, a bitter battle in the company about this, because the chairman of the company, an Irishman called Lawrence Sullivan, did not want to in effect turn the company into an empire builder. He was a very shrewd businessman, and he could see that empires cost money. But Clive, of course, was very persuasive, and he had his supporters. Sullivan had his supporters, and in the end, Clive won the day. But of course, Sullivan was right, because really thereafter, the company, once it got control and ruling Bengal, but had all the problems of running law and order and all the rest of it, and paying for the army, in effect, it never made any money after that. I mean, they were huge. You see, these each of the presidencies at Bengal and Chennai and Mumbai, they had their own armies. And these were big armies. These were 50,000 men. So in total, the East India Company had under its control 150,000 men. This is a time when I think Wellington was fighting the Peninsular War with about 10,000, maybe 15,000. And the East India Company's got combined armies of 150,000, nearly all, of course, Indians, sepoys with European officers. But they cost money. And as I say, Sullivan was dead right. You know, he wanted the company to trade and make money. Clive wanted power and glory, and Clive won. And of course, the company ceased really to make any serious money. Well, the next slide, please. That actually is one interesting one, because it shows Clive with the Mogul Emperor, and the short, stocky chap behind him is actually George Van Sittart, who was the younger brother of Henry Van Sittart. He was apparently fluent in Persian, and that was the language of the court. So it's all the Diwani. Clive is being handed the Diwani, but it's all been done in Persian. And as I say, George Van Sittart there is the translator. Henry Van Sittart, in effect, came back in 1770. But lost all his money in the Great Famine. As a result of the famine in 1770 in Bengal, the shares, the value of the East India Company just plummeted, went to the floor. He had all his money in the East India Company. He was ruined. So basically, he went out again. He got himself another job out in India, and he was on the way out there by ship when the ship foundered off Madagascar, and he was drowned in 1770. He was quite young. His brother, on the other hand, didn't, manage to make a fair amount of money, came back and became a member of Parliament for Berkshire, and he bought Bisham Abbey, which is an interesting place, because Bisham Abbey is now owned by the National Sports Foundation, but it started off life as a Knights Templar foundation. And when the order was suppressed by Edward II in 1307, the king took possession and used it as a prison. And believe it or not, Queen Elizabeth, who was the wife of Robert the Bruce, was imprisoned there I was interested in that because I thought Edward II had lost the Battle of Bannockburn, but eventually, obviously, he may have lost that battle, but he captured the wife of Robert the Bruce and imprisoned her in down in Bisham Abbey. Later, the Earls of Salisbury and then the Hoby family owned it, and then during the Hoby tenure, the next Princess Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth, was also imprisoned there, this time by her sister Mary. Lady Hoby's ghost is said to haunt the place, and she started life, and this is quite interesting, as a Miss Cook of Gidea Hall in Essex, which was bought by Richard Benyon on first returning from India in 1744. So you get all these links with links with links. Have we got another slide on them? I think we've got a picture. Yes, that in fact is Bisham Abbey, which is same. This is Hollyport Manor School, which is now a special school, but it's called Foxley Court originally, and that was property bought by Henry Van Sittart. Actually, also he went to Reading School first before going to Eton, and he bought Reading Abbey, the ruins of Reading Abbey, and gave it to the corporation. So the fact the corporation owns Reading Abbey ruins is down to Henry Van Sittart. Next one. All right, that's the final. So right, so we'll now move on to Basildon Park. Have we got a slide then? Yes, Francis Sykes, from 1730 to 1804. He was a Yorkshireman who was sent to India age 18 on the same ship as Warren Hastings. He was based in Bengal and became a member of the Bengal Council. He was caught up in the events which led up to the Battle of Plassey, and following the grant of the Diwani in 1765, he was placed in charge of Kozim Bazaar, a very wealthy silk spinning district. He'd make money in the 5 years, but up to then, but in the 5 years that followed, he made really serious money. Sir John Sykes, I say, his descendant, my sadly now deceased, but my friend, reckons that he probably in today's money made about 500 million. Quite incredible. And enough anyway, when he came back, he bought 3 estates, not just Basildon, he bought 2 other estates as well, and he built Basildon Park. Basildon Park, he used a fellow architect called John Carr to build it. It is the actually only house actually built by a nabob in Berkshire. Nowadays it's owned by the National Trust. But it's interesting, it's the only one, and there's nothing Indian about it whatsoever. This is a Palladian country house. You know, he made his money in India, but having come back, he wanted to be regarded as an English country gentleman. I've already mentioned that, you know, with his money, he bought up Wallingford so he could get a seat in Parliament. But he was actually quite a generous benefactor to Wallingford. He used to, in times of hardship, used to raise funds and put money in to help the poor of Wallingford. So his son actually died only 4 months after he did. So his son became the 2nd baronet very, very briefly. So the third, the grandson, who was only aged 5, became the 3rd baronet. He was brought up in Basildon and he grew up, and he managed to get through all the money. It had all went, and in 1838 he sold the whole property to another self-made man called James Morrison. There's an interesting story, incidentally, because Sir Francis Sykes married a great beauty called Henrietta Villebois. They were Huguenots who'd ended up in Norfolk and become brewers, and they had, let's call it an open marriage, because Henrietta had a lover in Benjamin Disraeli. And in fact, one of Benjamin Disraeli's novels is called Henrietta. And he was at Bradenham, where his parents were, his father was, and he used to ride over by horse over to Basildon to court Henrietta Villebois. So Francis didn't mind this, believe it or not, because he was having an affair with Disraeli's ex-mistress. And apparently the 4 of them used to go around in a coach together. But then one day, One day, this handsome painter came to paint the portrait, and she started having an affair with the painter. And at that, he was absolutely furious, was Sir Francis. He in fact put an advert in the Morning Chronicle in August 1837, saying that, right in the front page, as my wife's been found in bed with this painter, I disown her. And of course, it socially ruined her, made her a laughingstock through the length and breadth of the UK. But our painter had a great ally in Charles Dickens. He was a great friend of Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens at the time was writing Oliver Twist. And so those of you who know your Oliver Twist will know there's a character in that. I like to tease people, perhaps you're ahead of me by now. But anyway, Sir Francis William Sykes ended up as Bill Sykes in Oliver Twist. And of course, everybody knew the connection. So it actually ruined him as well. And they both died young. And as I say, all the money went and the estate was sold. So we will then actually, well, we're going to visit Basildon Park. And it's quite close. And that's a picture of it. And as it was built. And in fact, there's another picture, I think and that's as it is today. It has not changed. It is exactly the same as it was built in 1777 to 1783. And afterwards, we will go down to St. Bartholomew's Church in Lower Basildon. We could walk down or take the coach down, because this was where, and in the rectory, this is where Dr. George Bellasis lived at the time when Francis Sykes was in the big house. Dr. George Bellasis was in the rectory. He was the vicar of Basildon. He had a brother who was a major general in the East India Company in Bombay. And in effect, when I visited Bombay some years ago now and went round St. Thomas's Cathedral, I found 8 Bellasis memorials in the church to all the members of the Bellasis family who were involved with the East India Company. It included both the vicar's 2 sons, and both of whom died out in India, and also his daughter. Daughter was a tragedy. He married a chap in the Madras, an officer in the Bombay, I think, artillery. And then she'd only been out there a few months, caught cholera and died. And that was the fate of so many who went to India. They just went down with cholera or whatever it was, fever, and they died. She was only 25. Anyway, I can tell you more about this, but I think that's just some, and that of course is down in St. Bartholomew's. That is actually the picture of Sir Francis Sykes, Henriette of Villeroy, and their 4 children. I don't know why they're all dressed up in medieval armor, but that actually painting still exists. And my friend Sir John Sykes, he owns it. So it's still with the Sykes family. As he once said to me rather ruefully, all the money went, but I've still got some of the paintings. And Sir Francis Sykes is actually buried down in a vault, a sealed vault now, down at St. Bartholomew's Church. There's Dr. Bellasis, Vicar of Basildon, and that's his brother, the Major General, General Don Bellasis. So Purley Hall now. And Purley Hall is, this is Warren Hastings as a young man. And then we got another one, I think, of Warren Hastings after the cares of office. Yeah, Warren Hastings, whose dates are actually 1730 to 1818. So he was 88 when he died. So he lived a long life. He went to India, as I mentioned, on the same ship as Francis Sykes, to make his fortune and buy back the family estate of Daylesford. But when he returned from India in 1785, the owner of Daylesford was not interested in selling. So instead, Hastings bought a former Beaumont College. It's now the Haley Conference Centre in Old Windsor in Berkshire. which is nice and handy for the court. And in fact, there on the record, there's thanks to him for paying for marquees for the royal family for some do or other, keeping in with the royals. Then Daylesford became available, and so he bought it and moved to Daylesford. But then about 2 years after he'd returned to the UK, he was impeached. When he'd first been appointed as a Governor General of Bengal, the Parliament, Westminster, they'd set up a committee of 5 to control him, and they packed it. So there were 5, 3 of them were government appointees, and there was Hastings and one other. And in effect, the idea was to control him, so he couldn't do anything, could only in effect comply with government instructions. In fact, it led to some fair old battles, and Francis, who was one of the ones sent there, and Hastings fell out big time over the Rohillas and various other things. And in fact, they actually fought a duel, and in effect, Francis was almost killed. He survived, but he then came back from India, came back to England. And there, of course, he set about getting his revenge. And as I say in my book, manufacturing the bullets, which were eventually fired at Hastings in his impeachment by Burke and Sheridan, who were the leaders of the impeachment proceedings. I mean, I think actually Hastings had a very, very rough deal, because he, on whole, I think he was a very good governor. I think he was far-sighted. I think he was very fair. He did a lot, for instance, to protect Indian history and posterity, buildings, etc. He did a lot to develop the language, to introduce education. He did a lot of pluses for him. But he made enemies, and as I say, the enemies, it led to his impeachment. It went on for 7 years. Eventually, he was cleared of all charges, and finally, in the last years of his life, he was accorded the honors which I think he deserved. But while he was being impeached, he was too far from Daylesford, so in effect, he looked around for another property. I think myself, Francis Sykes, who actually he was Hastings was the executor of Francis Sykes, so they were close. I think Sykes must have put him on to the fact that Purley Hall was available. So he rented Purley Hall during the period of his impeachment. That is a picture out in Murshidabad of where we came across the grave of Hastings' first wife and one of his children. Another boy was brought back by Sykes to this country to be educated by the parents of Jane Austen, interestingly. That's Hastings' second wife, Mrs. the Baroness Imhoff. He was going back out to India. His wife had died, and he was taken quite seriously ill. And Marion Imhoff, who was on board, I don't know where she trained as a nurse, but anyway, she nursed him back to health, and they fell in love. Now, her husband, who was on the boat with them, was a German army officer, who was a very good artist, and he was going off to India to try and make his fortune, or at least make a living, sketching and whatnot, for the Indian princes and anyone else who would pay him. Anyway, so they came to an amicable arrangement. In effect, Hastings arranged for the Baron and the Baroness to divorce. He arranged then for the Baron to get good contacts so he could go off and make his money as his sketching, and he married the Baroness, Marion Hastings, and they were very devotedly married. And she already had 2 sons by the Baron, and they all both ended up as leading military rank in the East India Company. So they're all very happy. That's a picture of a sketch of Purley Hall. It was also later, the top floor was taken off. Interestingly, if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a Brahmin bull. In fact, Hastings, I think, developed a menagerie, brought a menagerie back from India from him, and he may have kept them with him, and they may have been down there at Purley Hall. I think the next one is the picture of the building as it is today. It's now owned by the Andersons. We arranged to go and actually have a look at it. There's actually nothing nabob inside it, but we will just go and have a look at it, and we can talk about the history of the building a bit more. It's got a very interesting history, actually, apart from its connection with Hastings. It started off life with, it was known as Hyde Hall because Edward Hyde built it. And Edward Hyde, when his wife died, he married a second time, Anne, and they had a daughter called Anne, another Anne, who then married James, the Duke of York, and they had two daughters. One was Mary, and the other one was Anne. So Mary married William, the Prince of Orange, and then we get Mary and William and Mary, and of course Anne became Queen Anne and married the Duke George of Denmark and Prince George of Denmark, and she became Queen Anne, and they're all connected through to the Hydes. And also later on, it was owned by a chap called Francis Hawes, who was the secretary of the East India, not East India Company, I want to talk about, the South Sea Bubble Company. And of course, when it went bust, you know, he lost everything. But he had a brother who had also made money with the South Sea Bubble Company and got his money out in time. So when the creditors came to sell Purley Hall, the brother stepped in and bought it and then put his brother back in. So he carried on living there. There's also an interesting story about the daughter, because the daughter, another Frances Hawes, she married a Lord Vane, and she became notorious in the country as a bolter. She used to go off with lovers all over the place. And Sir Francis Vane, who was besotted by her, he used to put adverts in the paper asking for information as to where she'd arrived at. And in fact, in the end, she wrote her memoirs and got she got Tobias Smollett to write her memoirs and included them. So if you want to read the adventures of Peregrine Pickle, there are 70 pages of it. All the actual, it's the autobiography of Lady Vane. It's very strange. Okay, next one. Swallowfield. Well, Swallowfield again has a very interesting history. Have we got a slide of show? Yes, the first one. We come at Thomas Pitt, Governor Diamond Pitt. The manor was originally owned by a Saxon called Saxey, a Saxon, and he was a member of Harold's bodyguard. And I think as all Harold's bodyguard fought to the death at the Battle of Hastings, I think Saxey would have been amongst them. But it had royal associations because all of Henry VIII's wives, bar Anne of Cleves, owned it. As each one disappeared, the next one took it on, except for Anne of Cleves. Then Samuel Backhouse, a London merchant, bought it in the 16th century, and it stayed in their family until the 18th century, when William Backhouse, who was a notorious chemist, astrologer, member of the Rosicrucians, and he was a friend of Elias Ashmole, the Ashmolean Museum. His daughter, Flower Backhouse, had 3 husbands. Her third was Henry Hyde, became the second Earl of Clarendon. So, as I say, the first Earl of Clarendon built Hyde Purley Hall. And because of the royal connection with Anne Hyde, married to the Duke of York, she became the first governor of Princess Anne and then first lady of her bedchamber when Anne became queen. So the connection there. And it was the third Earl who sold the property to Thomas Pitt in 1718. Pitt made some alterations to the house and he built the bridge over the Loddon, which we'll see. It's got his initials in it. It was his main residence till his death in 1726. And his grandson, Pitt the Elder, then sold it in 1738. By 1820, it was back in Nabob hands. Have we got a picture of Sir? Here we are. No, well, all right. Yes, I'll say Pitt purchased Pitt is famous for his diamond. He purchased one of the largest diamonds ever found. Probably came from the Golconda diamond mines near Hyderabad. It took over his life, and many acquisitions of skullduggery were laid at his door as a result. His cousin, George Pitt of Stratfield Say, which is now owned by the Duke of Wellington, looked after it for a time, and eventually it was sold to the Dauphin of France. It survived the revolution. It was then worn by Emperor Napoleon and the Empress Eugenie, and it's still owned by the French government. And when President Macron becomes Emperor of Europe, we may see it worn again. Anyway, the money from the sale of diamond helped to provide the financial base to fund the political careers of his grandson, Pitt the Elder, and great-grandson, Pitt the Younger. So we come on now to Sir Henry Russell, who actually went to my old college, or I went to his old college, Queen's College, Cambridge. He was a racist, but he was an honest judge and made no distinction between races when applying the law. Just when it came to personal family relationships that he drew the line. He only wanted pure British in his family. His son also, Sir Henry Russell, the second baronet, I think we've got of him. There he is. Was also a nabob and has been immortalized, if that's the right word, in William Dalrymple's book, White Moguls. He was the trusted right-hand man of Colonel Kirkpatrick, the resident of Hyderabad. We got a picture of him, I think we have. There he is, dressed in native garb. He was the resident of Hyderabad, who, to consternation of both English and Muslim society, married the much younger Muslim noblewoman called Kara Nissa. I think we got a picture of her. There she is. I think she was only 14 when she first saw him, and she wasn't much older when they married. They had 2 children. I think we've got a picture of them, haven't we? There they are. The one on the left is actually a boy, and the one on the right is a girl. One on the left is George, and the other on the right became Kitty, known as Kitty. Anyway, they had children. When Kirkpatrick died unexpectedly, Russell first seduced the widow and then abandoned her. He also appropriated, this is by Chinnery, the Chinnery portrait of the children, which used to hang at Swallowfield. And then Kara Nissa never got over it. She was only 27 when she died of shame and grief. Russell continued on his merry way to return to Swallowfield. His son, the 3rd Baronet, did something to redeem family honor by winning the VC at Inkerman during the Crimean War. And the Russells are related to the Benyons of Englefield through their connection to the Fleetwoods and the Shelleys. And did we have that? We got that? Yes, there they are. In the center is Governor Benyon. That is the Fleetwood and Shelley families. That is a portrait which used to hang at Swallowfield. It was then went to auction without telling Richard Benyon's father, Sir William Benyon, who would have bought it, but they didn't know about it. So it ended up in New York. So it's in New York now. Anyway, so that's Swallowfield, which is now, there it is, in the 18th century. It's been remodeled, but it's much the same. And today, of course, it's actually, I think, in flats. It's in sort of, it's run by, I forget the name now, but what company runs it. And basically you buy yourself a flat and there are communal, you pay into it and the grounds are maintained and there is a communal restaurant, etc., etc. That's the way it's run today. Right, next one. Englefield. And that's Richard Benyon, the original Richard Benyon. Englefield derives its name from the Englefield family, dating back to Saxon times. A major battle was fought there in 871 AD between the Vikings and the Saxons, which the Saxons won. The original Elizabethan manor house was first Georgianized and then Gothicized. The long gallery built in 1587, which you will see across what was once a public road, is said to have been built so that Queen Elizabeth could enter the house on the flat, on the level, without having to climb so many floors. And you'll see when you visit Englefield, there's about 5 lots of floors. It's a very tall building. It was purchased in 1635 by John Paulet, the 5th Marquis of Winchester, and has remained in the family ever since. That's a picture of a chap called Paulet, right? And it's painted by Gainsborough, and it shows shows Englefield when it had been Georgianized. The next one is, I think, that's what it is today, and it's been Gothicized in about 1850s. Paulet became Powlet, and in 1696, when the Marquis's son, Lord Powlet, died, his son Francis inherited. And when Francis died in 1712, the estate passed to his sister Anne, who'd married Reverend Nathan Wright. They had a son, Nathan, who married an heiress from Hackney called Mary Tyson, and her mother's name was de Beaver. Nathan Powlet Wright and Mary Tyson then had a son called Powlet Wright. We've just seen him in the previous slide, standing in front of the house. He married but had no children. Powlet Wright Sr. died in 1741, and his widow, Mary Tyson, then married the returning Nabob, Richard Benyon, whose dates were 1698 to 1774. She married him in 1745. They had a son, Richard, who died in 1796, who was a half-brother to Powlet Wright. And the second Richard had a son, another Richard. It's very confusing in the Benyons, they're always Richard, who adopted the name de Beaver. So he became Richard Benyon de Beaver. And as a result, when Powlet Wright died in 1799, Englefield first went to an uncle of Powlet Wright, and then in 1814 to Richard Benyon de Beaver, and it was de Beaver, Richard Benyon de Beaver, who developed Beaver Town in Hackney. And the Englefield estates still own about 350 properties, prime properties in de Beaver Town in Hackney, as well as 15,000 acres of Berkshire and a fairly large estate in Scotland. They're certainly the largest private landowners in Berkshire. Interestingly, Richard Benyon de Beaver also married the daughter of Sir Francis Sykes of Basildon Park, because Sir Francis, his first wife, had died. They remarried again, and they had a daughter, and she then married, say, Richard Benyon de Beaver. There's some uncertainty as to how Richard Benyon entered the employ of the East India Company at Madras at the early age of 14. He may have been an orphan, but had relatives already out there. But by 1718, aged just 20, he was a member of the Madras Council. And he married a Mary Fleetwood in 1724. The Fleetwoods were one of those families that divided over the Civil War. One brother fought for Parliament and was severely wounded at the First Battle of Newbury in 1643. And he then married one of Oliver Cromwell's daughters. The granddaughter, Amelia Morse, then married Henry Van Sittart. So that's the connection with with Oliver Cromwell. The other brother fought for the king, and Mary Fleetwood was descended from him. Another female Fleetwood, Elizabeth, born in 1700, married a Richard Shelley, who was born in Madras in 1703. Their granddaughter married Sir Henry Russell, the Chief Justice of Bengal. We've seen the picture of, say, with Governor Benyon with the Shelleys. They were all related. And in fact, the interesting thing about the Benyons is, if you inherit, it goes down, you have to carry the name Benyon. And twice they run out of direct heirs, and they had to go to other branches of the family. The first time this happened, they had to go to the Fellows family. Julian Fellows is a member of the Fellows family, Fellows, and there were three members of they were known as the three lucky Fellows, because each of them, in effect, inherited estates. One of them inherited Englefield and changed his name to Benyon. The same thing happened again with 2 generations on, because they ran out of heirs again, and they had to turn to the Shelleys. So they went to the Shelleys, and William Shelley, who was actually MP for Buckingham, he actually changed his name to Benyon and moved down to Berkshire and in fact took over and so his son was actually born Richard Benyon, but seeing his father started life as William Shelley, but became William Benyon in order to inherit. Right. So when we go around, when we go to visit, we'll see Governor Benyon brought an awful lot of things back from they're all there in the house. His sedan chair, his sword, paintings, quite a lot of stuff to see which he brought back. They also, all the records they brought back, they're all actually in the Berkshire Record Office, but I was, they were to being a historian, it was very useful to to be able to go there, and you get a very good idea of how the whole thing ran from going through the records. So we are. It's a brief canter around some of the properties that we will see or visit, and I'm, as I say, I'm very happy to deal with take any questions or queries. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive, very much. That was fascinating. And while I'd heard a little bit of it before, I thought this was quite incredible, all the connections that you've gone through. And it appears that it was quite an incestuous society, both here in Berkshire and in India. And they appeared to have been overall ruling much of the British Empire, at least out in India at the time. And did the word nepotism exist at the time? I think they seem to have propagated a lot of their children or friends or cousins and whatever into very high office. So it would have been interesting to see what the recruitment interviews were like at the time.
They were eagerly sought after to try and get a position. You know, it was eagerly. And interestingly, you see, the way it worked was in this country, the eldest son inherited the estate. The next son they used to put in the army. Third one, or maybe in the church. They didn't do with the fourth or fifth. So they would bundle them off to the East India Company if they could get them a position. You see, people like Sir Francis Sykes, you know, came from fairly obscure, but they obviously had some connection to get him, in fact, onto the books to get out there. And in fact, they were paid nothing. They paid about £5 a year. I mean, it was the opportunity to make money when you got out there. And as I say, and they tended to be the youngest scions, and so they weren't all lords and ladies going out there. They were sort of lower down. They were more, well, not middle class, but you know, well, Sykes is a good example. You know, he was Yorkshire squire.
I believe there are some questions. Okay, let's have a look at the first of the questions. It says, earlier you mentioned Gaidia in Essex. Was there a Nabob house in Gaidia Park, or is that something
Yes,
that
I mean, when he came back from, he bought Gidea Hall. He was an Essex boy, was Richard Benyon. The original came from Essex. They were the Essex lad, and so he bought Gidea Hall, Gidea Park, and it stayed in the family for a while. But then, as I say, he married the Mary Tyson, and in effect they moved, and he really made his base Englefield then. But he did have Gidea for a while. Yes, that would be. I mean, it's a school now. I think it's a school. Yeah, but I mean, if you were doing a staycation tour in East Anglia, then obviously that would be one of the properties you could include on it.
Okay, well, I think that question was from Susan, and she said, I'm originally an Essex girl, so I wanted to know about that.
All about them.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you very much. If there are any other questions, we'd love to take those. So let's have would you consider a diversion to Stock Row at the Maharaja's, to the Maharaja's well, where there's a wealth of charity in the villages in Oxfordshire? It's on the borders. So we've considered that,
we did consider it. I mean, the thing about the Maharaja as well is it's a much later. Apparently, somebody from Stoke Row was the resident out there. Is it? I forget which Maharaja it was, but anyway, he was there like advisor, and he was telling the Maharaja how the people in Stoke Row had no water. They had to go down. They had ponds, but if the ponds, and they had to go down to the river. And so the Maharaja said, "You poor Brits, you know, I'll pay for a well." So he actually provided the money. This was Indians' aid, you see, Indian aid to Britain, to England, and he paid to dig the well, and so they could get water.
So what exists of it today, Clive?
Well, I mean, I think they get the water from the mains now, but I mean, yeah, yes, you can get water. I mean, in my village in Basildon, we still have wells where you could draw the water up because that's where the water came from. But they're all dug. They tend to be dug late in the 19th century. Up to then, they really lived on ponds and having to go down the river. If you ran out of water, you had to go down the river and get some water out of the river.
Okay.
So it's not really a nabob thing. It's post nabob. It's during the time of the Raj.
Okay. We have another question. Patsy Miller. Patsy's asking us, how did the Nabobs make their money out in India? We've said that they made a great deal of money and it came from the Divani. But are you able to elaborate on that a little, Clive?
Well, I mean, they most of it was made. A lot of it was made, well, in various ways. It was made from trade, but they used to. It was they weren't honest. The East India Company got itself a dastak, which was a right not to have to be charged custom duty. And so on the back of that, they used to do their individual trades, and they used to rely on the dastak to actually avoid paying the customs duties which native Indian traders had to pay. Gave them a head advantage. So that was one unscrupulous way they made money. They made money with the way Sykes made money was for ruling, in effect, ruling the Diwani, and he was allowed to take 5% of the income in Bengal, in Kozim Bazar. And I mean, if you're allowed to collect all the tax in the wealthiest suburb, the wealthiest district in the wealthiest country in the world at the time, you've got a lot of money going through your hands. If you're allowed to keep 5%, you make serious money. So that was another way. There were contracts, you know, there were a whole way they made money, but that's some of the principal ways they made it. They had banyans, so they called them banyans, like trading partners. And interestingly, Sykes and Sykes's banyan partner, they're still in touch. The families are still in touch. I've met the descendants of Cantu, who was in fact Sykes's banyan. The two families have stayed in touch over those hundreds of years, and they visit each other. And I've actually met the descendants of the Cantu, you know, of his banyan. So you know they could become very close. And I mean, companies like what's the one, the steelworks, Mittal and whatnot, and I mean they were all trading with the East India Company.
Right.
They've been going. A lot of them are actually Persian. They're Zoroastrian. You know, they're descendants from Persian. But yes, there's these very long trading routes, and they were there back in the times of the East India Company, and they've stayed on and they carried on developing, and now so they're great sort of industrial enterprises. Their roots go way back to the time of the East India Company.
So what would have been the trade? Would it have been spices, or was it other kind, cloth or cotton?
Yeah,
or what?
Spices, silks, special, you name it. I mean, eventually, for instance, somebody like Marzak, for instance, we will go to Caversham Park. Marzak was actually an engineer out there. So he had a salary, but because he was an engineer, he made his money by designing houses for wealthy Indians in Awadh. You see, Awadh got conquered in effect by the East India Company. So the Nawab of Awadh, or Oudh, he had no army. In fact, he had to rely on the East India Company for his security. But because they opened up trade down the Hooghly River, Oudh became very wealthy. Places like Lucknow, there was a lot of money there. And so they liked European houses. And so this chap Marzak made a fortune designing European houses for the Indians, for his clients out there. So he was like an architect, you know, he's using his military expertise to design European style houses. They called it Anglo-Mughal style for wealthy Indians. They all made money in different ways.
And a lot of our clients have traveled out to Lucknow to look at these houses. The entire streets are full of just European style houses out in Lucknow. And
well, he will have designed some of those. I put one in my book, the Kufil, I forget it. I put in my book, I had a picture of it, believed to be by him. And I say that's how he made his money. He also had his salary as a major, but that, you know, he made his money on the commissions.
Right. We have another question from Patsy again. Where and how does Halesbury School come into the East India Company? Do you have any
Where
comment?
in, sorry, where in
Halesbury. Uh,
Hilbury?
is that connected with the East India Company? Patsy, do you have your microphone and maybe you'd like to ask the question?
Yeah, I'm not,
No, okay. You're not familiar with that at all.
I don't, that doesn't ring any bells. What, a property over here?
Hmm. Yeah,
Hilbury?
Hailbury, Hailbury.
Oh, Halesbury. Oh, you're talking about the, oh yeah, Halesbury. Yeah, yeah. Sorry. That became the East India Company, in effect, college for training company writers. They went to Halesbury. So it became, and in fact, they were very advanced because, in fact, a lot of the practices from Halesbury were adapted by the English civil service.
Ah,
They learned, they learned from India. Yeah.
right.
And it became a public school in the end. Halesbury still is a public school, but it started life as a college to train the writers to go out to administer the East India Company's vast possessions out in India. Yeah.
Tremendous. It became a very organized uh, uh, sort of industry then.
Oh yes, and I mean, considering, consider, they were ruling, or at least administering huge areas,
Mhm.
huge areas. I mean, General Nicholson. The interesting one is he was sent. Uh, he had Roberts as his right hand man. They had near Banu. They had 1 million subjects to look after.
Mhm.
The two of them.
Right. God.
I mean, they obviously employed local, Pathans and whatnot, but basically just the two of them, running an area sort of with 1 million people.
That's
Really,
remarkable
like,
to have that sort of power so young, you said
I
that.
know, I know. They still apparently, I understand, there's still a saying in Patan, who do you think you are, Nicholson?
uh,
So it made an impression.
Certainly did. There's another question from Dorothy Pickering, and Dorothy asks if Purley Hall was owned at one stage by the Wilder family until the 1950s, who owned Solemn Estate. The
Yeah.
descendants still do run the estate. Do you know how the Wilders would have been able to acquire it?
Well, you're right. The Wilders had it for a while, and the Wilders are still at Sulhamstead.
Mm.
They made that. They're big in. They're still big in. They had a business in Wallingford. I think they were. I don't know the full extent, but they made money. They were merchants and whatnot, and made money. In fact, I think you can see the was it the drain, not the drain pipes, but the drains. They've got Wilder on them. I think they had a sort of an iron. They were iron masters. I think they had a bit of an iron business going. They were manufacturing sort of bits. They had many parts, and they made money and bought the Sulhamstead. But they did also own Purley Hall later. Yes, they did.
Oh, okay. And now, thank you for that. There's another question from Tom Dobinson. If the Banyans were the trading partners with the Nabobs,
Hmm.
what did the Nabobs actually contribute to the relationship?
Um, that's a good point. Well, I think they were. I mean, I think the Nabob would presumably be providing the capital. I mean, they would discuss things, and then the Banyan would go off, and he would do all the negotiation. It was a sort of partnership. I mean, for instance, the Banyan, Sykes's Banyan, became a minor Nabob, became a Maharaja. I think the present one is a Maharaja or something, or Maharan.
Mm,
Have got sort of quite well to do
mhm,
in India. They made money, and of
mhm.
course, and some of them made a lot of money.
Okay. So perhaps they actually funded or organized the shipments and so on. But I think
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
procurement, perhaps, in my recollection, was maybe done by the Banyans. and then the shipping over and the sale of the goods once they arrived in the UK may have been the Nabobs doing. Right. Patsy comes back to us and says, thanks you, Clive, for the answer, and says her ancestors were in the East India Company and died at sea out in Madras in 1854. And she has seen his application for the East India Company as a soldier. He died as a colonel. So, Patsy, you probably have a great deal of recollections and memorabilia, perhaps, in the family. And it would be lovely to chat at some stage. And thank you for sharing with us. And yeah. Okay. I don't have any other questions, and I think what I'd like to do is thank you, Clive, for this lovely evening. And I think it's something that what we need is. Oh, sorry, no, I do have a question. There is one other question before I thank you. It says Susan Bromley Challoner. Susan Bromley Challoner says, having worked in the City of London for years, you cannot move 2 yards in the city without some reference or street name or a building mentioning the East India Company. So I think that possibly, yes, Susan, is a hint that maybe that's an area that we need to look at a tour as well. So maybe we'll encourage Clive to do a bit of research on that side and consider it. But there are amazing buildings in central London with connections to the East India Company. In fact, very close to Christie's office is the East India House.
My current project, I'm looking at the Craven family of Berkshire. You know, they came from nowhere, made a fortune, and then it all went. But their first house they had, having made money in London, they leased it to the East India Company, and it was East India Company's first headquarters. And I've actually got a picture of it. And the East India Company virtually pulled it down and rebuilt their headquarters. So I got a picture of that as well. Quite incredible.
The East India Company retains the East India House, and I forget which square it's on, but it's an amazing and remarkable building, and it's now a club. And you can go in and have a look at it, and it's fabulous. I've been there once, and I think it might be one of the things that we would consider doing, looking at what's available in London over the coming weeks and months. Yeah, thank you. Lovely. So thank you very much, Clive. Again, I'll begin to wind up. And Clive, like I said, is leading a tour for us in July, departing 14th of July. It's a 3-night tour that looks at the various houses we've spoken of and a few additionally. And that house, that tour stays in Donington Grove, a Nabob estate in itself. And it's still vast, absolutely huge and beautiful, with a lovely Japanese temple and garden as well. So you're all very welcome to come along and join us for that. If you'd like more details, then get in touch with us at the email shown here, inquiries@transindus.com, and the phone number is also given if you'd like. And the same is the contact detail if you'd like a copy of Clive's book. And I'll thank you with that and leave you with this, and we'll bid farewell. And I hope to be in touch with each of you shortly. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, Clive.
Goodbye.
And thank you, Jess.